The humidity of the garden pressed against my skin, thick with the scent of expensive lilies and champagne, but the only thing I could feel was the vibration against my thigh. 3 short buzzes. A secret code in a public space. I adjusted my blazer, the armor of a successful litigator, while my pulse hammered a frantic, messy rhythm against my ribs. I shouldn't be checking my phone. I definitely shouldn't be looking for her. But then the crowd shifted, and I saw the flash of emerald silk cutting through the pastel sea of guests. Liliana. The air left my lungs in a sharp, painful rush. My life is built on precedent, on statutes, clear lines of argumentation, and the comforting architecture of billable hours. I don't do ambiguity. I don't do complicated. Yet, for the last 12 months, the most significant relationship in my life has existed entirely within the encrypted borders of a messaging app. We call her V, or rather, she calls herself V, and I am simply E. It started on a legal forum, of all places, a debate about intellectual property rights that spiraled into a discussion about art, then philosophy, then desire. We stripped away the names, the locations, the specifics, leaving only the raw data of who we were. It was safe. It was contained. It was the one uncontrolled variable I allowed myself, because I thought I could close the app and turn it off. I was wrong. The wedding venue was a sprawling estate in the Hudson Valley, the kind of place that charged 5 figures just for the atmosphere. The air was heavy, clinging to the back of my neck, smelling of cut grass and the distinct metallic tang of anxiety. My sister, Claire, was somewhere near the altar, radiating a brittle kind of joy. This was her day, her second chance at happiness after the disaster that was her 20s. And standing on the periphery of that joy was the ghost of disasters past, Liliana. Claire and Liliana hadn't been together for 3 years. Their breakup had been a scorched earth campaign that left the family divided and awkward silences at Thanksgiving. I had stayed out of it. I was the neutral party, the career-obsessed older sister who observed the wreckage from a safe distance. But safe feels like a lie when your pocket is burning. I swirled the ice in my glass, watching the condensation weep down the sides. The phone buzzed again. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew the smart move was to leave it in my clutch, to engage in small talk with my aunt about her prize-winning dahlias, to be the good sister, the good lawyer, the good daughter. But the pull was physical, a hook in my sternum dragging me forward. I slipped the phone out, shielding the screen from the prying sunlight. "Where are you?" the message read. "The crowd is suffocating." I typed back, my thumb hovering over the glass. "Wedding. Family obligation. You?" "Close," V replied. "Closer than you think." The words sent a spike of adrenaline through my bloodstream that had nothing to do with caffeine. We had never met. We had strict rules about anonymity. We didn't swap photos, didn't share voice notes. We traded thoughts, confessions, the kind of secrets you only tell a stranger in the dark. I knew she was brilliant. I knew she had a scar on her left shoulder from a childhood accident. I knew she hated the smell of lavender but loved the scent of old books. I knew she wanted to be touched with a specific, heavy pressure that grounded her when the world got too loud. I looked up, scanning the crowd again, the paranoia setting in. Was she here? Was this a coincidence or a game? The idea that V could be one of these people, a cousin's date, a colleague, a friend of the groom, was terrifying. It threatened to collapse the firewall I'd built between my real life and my digital escape. Then I saw Claire waving me over, her smile tight. She looked beautiful, but fragile, like spun sugar that might shatter if the humidity rose another degree. She needed me to be solid. She needed me to be the anchor. She didn't know that her anchor was currently drifting, untethered by 3 lines of text and the sudden, irrational fear that the woman who knew my darkest desires was breathing the same air. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, but the phantom vibration lingered on my skin, a reminder that control is just an illusion we sell ourselves to sleep at night. Liliana didn't just walk across the lawn. She cut through the atmosphere of the wedding like a shear through silk. While the rest of the guests were a blur of pastels and nervous laughter, she was high contrast, a stroke of emerald ink on a watercolor canvas. The sunlight caught the sharp angle of her jaw and the confident, predatory cadence of her stride. She moved with the deliberate lethargy of someone who owns the space she occupies, regardless of the invitation list. My mouth went dry. It wasn't thirst, but the physiological drought of sudden, acute danger. My heart hammered a warning rhythm against my ribs, a traitorous tempo that had nothing to do with sisterly protection and everything to do with a buried, visceral memory. I remembered this presence. I remembered the way the air seemed to compress around her, heavy and charged. 3 years hadn't dulled the edge of her gravity. If anything, she had sharpened it. She stopped in front of us, and the silence that descended was thick enough to choke on. "Claire," Liliana said. Her voice was a low hum, a cello note vibrating in the open air. "You look happy." That's all I wanted to see. Claire stiffened beside me, her knuckles turning white around the stems of her bouquet. "Thank you for coming, Liliana. It was unexpected." "I wouldn't miss the family drama," Liliana said, a dry smile touching her lips. Then her gaze slid to me. It was a physical impact, like stepping off a curb I hadn't seen. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and amused, holding mine with invasive intensity. I stepped forward, the automatic reflex of the older sister, the lawyer, the shield. "Liliana," I said, keeping my voice professional, the polished tone I used to dismantle hostile witnesses. "It's been a while. I trust you're doing well?" "Better than well, counselor," she replied. She stepped into my personal space, ignoring the invisible boundary I'd erected. She leaned in to press a perfunctory kiss to my cheek, a social grace weaponized into an intimate invasion. That's when it hit me. The scent. It wasn't the floral perfume that 90% of the women here were wearing. It was distinct, earthy, sandalwood and something sharp, like ozone before a storm. The smell of rain hitting hot pavement. It bypassed my logic centers and went straight to the lizard brain. It felt known, deeply, instinctively known. It triggered a sense of déjà vu so disorienting I almost stumbled back. Why did that scent make me think of late-night screens and blue light? V had never described her perfume. We talked about textures, about tastes, about the ache of distance. But this smell felt like the missing sensory data point in a graph I'd been building for a year. It was the scent of a secret dragged into the sun. I pulled back, perhaps too quickly. Liliana's smile sharpened. She saw the flinch. She saw the flush rising on my neck. "You seem tense," she murmured, low enough that Claire couldn't hear over the sudden swell of the violins. "Work keeping you up?" "Something like that," I managed, my voice tight. "You should learn to relax," she said, her eyes dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before snapping back up. Tension causes mistakes. Before I could retort, the wedding planner, a harried woman with a headset, materialized to herd us toward the ceremony seating. "Family in the front row, please. We're on a schedule." "After you," Liliana said, gesturing with a languid hand. I turned to walk away, my legs feeling strangely heavy, like I was wading through water. The phone in my pocket buzzed again against my thigh, a single, long vibration. A warning? An invitation? I didn't check it. I couldn't, because as I walked toward the white folding chairs, I was terrifyingly aware that the ghost I'd been chasing on my screen felt suspiciously like the woman walking 10 paces behind me. The variables were shifting, the firewall was failing, and for the first time in my career, I didn't know how to argue my way out of the verdict. The ceremony was an exercise in endurance, a performance of stillness under a sun that felt less like a blessing and more like an interrogation lamp. We were seated in rows of white wood that dug into the spine, arranged in a perfect geometry on the lawn. I sat in the front row, the dutiful sister, my hands folded in my lap, mimicking the posture of someone listening to the officiant's meditation on trust and transparency. But my entire sensory field was narrowed to the square inches of fabric covering my right thigh. The heat was suffocating, a physical weight that pressed the silk of my blouse against my skin. A bead of sweat traced a slow, maddening line down my spine. I couldn't shift. I couldn't check the time. I was trapped in the amber of social expectation, forced to witness the union of two people while my own reality threatened to fracture. Then it happened. The vibration against my leg was distinct. Not the continuous hum of a call, but a pattern I had conditioned myself to recognize, like a heartbeat. Buzz, buzz, buzz. A triple pulse. V's signature. It was the signal we used when the need to speak was urgent. A digital tap on the shoulder that meant, I am here, pay attention. My breath hitched, a small, sharp sound lost under the swell of a cello. I shouldn't look. To check a phone during the vows was a capital offense in the court of family politics. But my eyes, betraying my better judgment, didn't go to my pocket. They went to the periphery. They went to her. Liliana was seated across the aisle, in the Friends of the Family section, a diplomatic exile. She looked bored, her profile etched against the green backdrop of the hedges, her posture relaxed in a way that made everyone else look rigid. As the third buzz faded from my skin, I saw her hand move. It was a subtle motion, practiced and covert. Her fingers slipped into the small, beaded clutch resting on her lap. The clasp didn't click. She was too careful for that. She angled the bag just enough to see the screen, her eyes dropping for a fraction of a second. A micro-expression flickered across her face, not a smile, but a softening, a recognition. Then, with the same fluid grace, her hand withdrew, and she returned her gaze to the altar, the picture of attentive respect. The world didn't stop, but the axis shifted violently beneath my feet. It wasn't a shock. It was a terrifying alignment of data points, a cascade of logic that clicked into place with the finality of a prison lock, the scent of sandalwood and rain, the intellectual arrogance, the specific cutting vocabulary V used, words like cadence and suture that mirrored the way Liliana dissected arguments, the text message, closer than you think. My heart didn't race. It stopped. Then restarted with a heavy, sickening thud. I had spent a year stripping myself bare for a stranger. I had confessed my loneliness, my hunger for control, the specific way I wanted to be unraveled. I had told V about the pressure of being the perfect sister. I had told V about the recurring dream where I was silenced by a hand over my mouth. I had told Liliana every intimate confession, every late-night vulnerability, every digital gasp was suddenly recontextualized. The safety of the screen evaporated. I wasn't speaking to a ghost. I was speaking to the one woman in the world who was strictly off limits. The woman who had broken my sister's heart. The woman sitting 10 feet away, looking at me with a peripheral awareness that now felt predatory. Did she know? The question burned through me. Did she know E was me? Or was she just as blind, texting a stranger to alleviate the boredom of her ex's wedding? The officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," and the applause broke the silence like a thunderclap. The sound was jarring, violent. Everyone stood up, a wave of cheering bodies. I stood with them, my legs numb, my hands trembling as I clapped, a mechanical performance of joy. Across the aisle, Liliana stood too. She turned, her eyes sweeping the crowd, and for a moment, her gaze locked onto mine. It was heavy, loaded with a secret she might not even know she was keeping. The air between us wasn't just humid anymore. It was charged, volatile. I had to face her at the reception. I had to sit at a table, drink wine, and pretend that I wasn't carrying the knowledge that the woman I desired was the one person I could never have. The ceremony was over, but the trial was just beginning. The reception seating chart was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive engineering, a sprawling map of family obligations and social debts pinned to a velvet board near the entrance. I found my name and felt the dry, humorless laugh die in my throat before it could escape. Table 9, the designated singles table. It was a purgatory of second cousins, college roommates, and the unattached debris of two merging families. And there, pinned right next to my placard like a cruel joke, was hers. Liliana, Of course. It was a trap disguised as hospitality, a singles table irony that felt less like a coincidence and more like a cage match designed by my well-meaning sister. The tent was a canvas cathedral, white peaks rising against the violet twilight. But inside, the air was heavy with the scent of roasted lamb, expensive perfume, and the humidity of 100 bodies. We made our way to the table. The chairs were gold chivari, elegant but flimsy, jammed together with an optimism that defied basic physics. As I settled in, smoothing the skirt of my navy dress, the professional armor I wore to disappear, I realized the spatial failure immediately. There was no gap. Liliana sat, and the emerald silk of her thigh pressed against the navy wool of mine. It was a collision of textures that sent a shockwave straight up my spine. A line of contact, hot and absolute, running from knee to hip. "Cozy," Liliana murmured, leaning in. Her breath ghosted over the shell of my ear, smelling of oaky red wine. She didn't pull away. Neither did I. That was the terrifying part. The lawyer in me knew the protocol. Shift weight, angle the chair, establish the necessary professional boundaries. But the woman who had spent a year typing her darkest fantasies into the void stayed frozen, hyper-aware of the friction. It was a horny but compliant tension, a silent agreement to exist in this charged radius while discussing the weather with a tax accountant named Greg. Dinner was a blur of sensory input I couldn't process. The sharp clink of silver against china sounded like gunshots in the heavy air. The wine was dark, coating my tongue with tannins. But mostly, it was the heat. Liliana radiated it. Her bare shoulder was inches from my face every time she turned to speak. I found myself staring at the slope of her neck, the way the tendon jumped when she laughed, the small mole near her collarbone that I wanted to trace with my thumb. I tried to maintain the facade. I cut my chicken with surgical precision. I nodded at the right times. But then she reached for the salt. Her arm brushed mine, not a bump, but a drag. Valid, deliberate contact. Her fingers grazed my wrist, cool against my feverish skin, dismantling my guard with terrifying efficiency. "Excuse me," she said, but her voice had dropped an octave. She wasn't apologizing. She was acknowledging the spark. My phone buzzed in my lap. The vibration went straight through the napkin, straight into the muscle of my leg that was still burning from her touch. I looked down, shielding the screen with a trembling hand. V. The woman in the navy dress next to me is trembling. I wonder if she knows I can feel her heat through the fabric. The world narrowed down to those glowing pixels. It wasn't a generic comment. It was a coordinate, a targeting laser. The woman in the navy dress. Me. She was writing about me to E, unaware that E was the woman trembling beside her. Or perhaps she knew exactly what she was doing. I looked up. Liliana was sipping her wine, the corner of her mouth quirked up in a private, dangerous smirk. The Inquisition arrived with the second course. Aunt Carol leaned across the centerpiece of white roses, her curiosity as blunt as the butter knife she wielded like a gavel. "So, Elena," she chirped, her voice carrying over the ambient jazz. "Still married to the firm? Or have you finally found time for a personal life? We were starting to worry you'd bring a subpoena as a +1. I stiffened, gripping the stem of my wine glass until my knuckles turned white. It was the standard interrogation for a single woman over 30, the price of admission for a career that intimidated them. Beside me, I felt Liliana shift, her presence a radiating heat against my side. "Just the firm, Aunt Carol," I lied, my voice practiced and smooth. "The hours don't really allow for distractions. I prefer it that way. It's uncomplicated." The lie tasted like ash. Beside me, Liliana didn't make a sound, but the vibration against my thigh was instantaneous. Buzz. I glanced down. Under the heavy drape of the linen tablecloth, my phone screen lit up in the shadow of my napkin. V. Uncomplicated. Is that what you tell yourself? Or is that just what you tell people who don't know how loud you get when you lose control? The air left my lungs in a sharp rush. She was doing it. She was sitting 6 inches away, dissecting my polished lies in real time. It was a terrifying bifurcation of reality. Above the table, we were estranged family connections passing the bread rolls. Below the surface, in the digital dark, she was stripping me bare. "It must be lonely," Liliana said aloud, her voice silky and low. She turned to me, swirling the dark red wine in her glass. "All that structure. No chaos, no mess." "I manage," I said, forcing myself to meet her dark, amused gaze. "I have outlets." "Outlets," she repeated, tasting the word like a foreign spice. "Sounds clinical, like a surge protector. I always pictured you as someone who needed a fuse to blow every now and then." "Buzz. V, tell her about the nights you wake up gasping. Tell her about the friction you crave. Tell her outlets. Don't whisper back." My pulse roared in my ears. This was a game of chicken played with emotional dynamite. She was challenging me, daring me to break the facade. I took a drink of wine, needing the bitterness to ground me, but as I set the glass down, the boundary dissolved. Under the table, her knee moved. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, steady pressure. Her knee pressed against mine, the emerald silk sliding against my navy wool, a solid, unyielding weight. It was a violation of the truce, a breach of the physical distance I had been trying to maintain. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The contact was a live wire, sending a jolt of heat flooding up my thigh, pooling heavy and hot in my stomach. I pressed back, just a fraction, acknowledging the pressure, accepting the dare. Liliana's eyes widened slightly, pupils blown in the dim light. She felt it. She knew I felt it. The air between us thickened, charged with static. "You know," she murmured, leaning in until her shoulder brushed mine, "I always thought you were too rigid for secrets, Elena. But you're vibrating with them tonight." "Everyone has secrets, Liliana," I managed, my voice rougher than intended. "Some are more dangerous than others," she whispered. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, lingering there with an intensity that felt like a touch. "Buzz. V, I dare you to tell the truth. Just once. Look at me and say it." I was on the precipice. I could say it. I could lean in, bridge the 3 inches, and whisper, "I know it's you." I could shatter the peace, ruin the reception, and finally get the answer. But then the sharp, piercing ring of a spoon against a glass cut through the tension. "If everyone could take their seats," the best man bellowed from the stage. "It's time for the toasts." Liliana pulled back, the contact breaking like a snapped thread. The cold rush of air where her leg had been was physically painful. She turned toward the stage, her profile unreadable, leaving me breathless, terrified, and vibrating with a text I couldn't answer. The speeches finally, mercifully, ended, dissolving into the kind of applause that signals relief rather than approval. The sun had dipped below the tree line, dragging the humidity down with it, leaving the air cool and thick with the promise of bad decisions. The reception tent, once a bright cathedral of propriety, was transforming. The lights dimmed to a sultry amber, the volume rose, and the open bar began to do its heavy lifting. Inhibitions were being stripped away like layers of silk. I needed to escape the blast radius of the table. The proximity to Liliana was becoming unsustainable. My skin felt too tight, my nerves frayed by the constant, silent vibration of the phone against my leg and the louder, heavier presence of her body against mine. I murmured an excuse about finding the restroom and slipped out the side flap of the tent, stepping onto the stone terrace that overlooked the darkened lawn. The air here was sharper, smelling of cooling earth and the distant Hudson River. I leaned against the balustrade, taking a breath that didn't taste like expensive catering and repressed desire. I closed my eyes, trying to recalibrate, trying to build the firewall back up. "You run away a lot for someone who claims to be in charge." The voice came from the shadows to my left. I didn't jump. My body had been tracking her location like a radar system since she arrived. Liliana stepped into the pool of light cast by the tent, a flute of champagne dangling loosely from her fingers. She looked devastating in the half-light, the emerald dress turning black, her skin luminous. "I'm not running," I said, gripping the cold stone. I'm strategizing. Is that what you call it? She moved closer, invading my personal space with that casual, terrifying entitlement. She rested her hip against the railing, facing me, ignoring the view. You looked like you were about to shatter in there, Elena. Every time your phone buzzed, you jumped. Work crisis, I lied. The words felt heavy and clumsy on my tongue. Liar. She took a sip of her drink, her eyes never leaving my face. That wasn't work. That was panic. And desire. I know the difference. She tilted her head, studying me like a complex case file. Who is he? Or she? The question hung in the air, suspended between us. The irony was a physical weight in my chest. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. It's you, I wanted to say. It's the woman who quotes Rilke at 2 a.m. and tells me how to breathe. There's no one, I said, my voice steady but low. There is someone, she countered, stepping closer until I could smell the sandalwood and the wine on her breath. I saw you smiling at your screen during the vows. A secret smile, the kind you never give to anyone here. Her voice dropped, becoming intimate, dangerous. Does she know you're here, pretending to be the Ice Queen? Liliana, I warned, but it lacked heat. Does she make you feel seen? She pressed, her gaze dropping to my mouth. Her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris, dark pools in the dim light. Because you're hiding in the dark at your sister's wedding, terrified to let anyone see the cracks. I'm not hiding. Then stop backing away. She was right. I was pressed against the stone, and she was the only thing in my field of vision. The tension was unbearable, a taut wire ready to snap. The urge to confess was a rising tide choking me. I could reach out. I could touch the bare skin of her arm. I could tell the truth and watch the world burn. I could pull my phone out and show her the text history, the map of our shared anatomy. Then, the music inside changed. The frantic jazz shifted into a slow, heavy bass line, a ballad that thrummed through the stone floor. Liliana set her glass on the ledge with a decisive clink. She didn't look away. She extended a hand, palm up, the gesture commanding, yet soft. "Prove it," she whispered, her voice a velvet summons. "Dance with me." I took the hand she offered. It felt like signing a contract without reading the fine print. Reckless, inevitable, and binding. Her palm was warm, the skin slightly rough against mine, a tactile detail V had once mentioned in passing about a rowing habit, another data point locking into place with a terrifying click. I let her pull me out of the shadows and onto the polished wood of the dance floor, stepping into the amber glow that felt less like mood lighting and more like an interrogation lamp. "Relax," Liliana murmured, her voice a low vibration that I felt in my chest before I heard it. She stepped into my space, dismantling the last foot of distance between us, with the confidence of someone who knows exactly where the property lines are drawn. This was the negotiation. The public contract stated we were two women, connected by a complicated web of family history, sharing a polite, perfunctory dance to placate the social gods. We were the good sister and the ex-fiancée, burying the hatchet for the sake of the bride. But the private reality was a demolition. She placed her hand on the small of my back. It wasn't a tentative, polite placement. It was a claim. Her fingers splayed wide, the heat of her palm burning through the navy wool of my dress, finding the exact curve of my spine. It was the heavy pressure V had described wanting weeks ago, a grounding weight that made my knees loosen. I raised my hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second, a lawyer reviewing the evidence, before resting it on her shoulder. My thumb grazed the bare skin of her neck, right where her pulse hammered a frantic, visible rhythm against the hollow of her throat. She wasn't as calm as she looked. That small, frantic beat was a confession. We moved. It wasn't a waltz, it was barely a sway. It was an exercise in gravity. We were orbiting a shared center that felt dangerously unstable. The crowd around us blurred into a watercolor smear of pastels, irrelevant and distant. There was only the heat of her hand, the scent of rain, and the terrifying realization that I was dancing with a ghost. Her thigh brushed mine, accidental, then deliberate, a friction of silk against wool that sent a static charge straight to my lungs. She stepped into me, forcing me to retreat, then pulled me back with that hand on my spine. Push and pull. The architecture of desire played out in 3/4 time. "You're following," she noted, her lips brushing the shell of my ear. "I thought you liked to lead." "I'm adapting," I countered, trying to keep my breathing even. The scent of sandalwood was overwhelming this close, filling my lungs, clouding my judgment. It's a necessary skill. "You're trembling again," she whispered. "It's the air conditioning." "It's 80 degrees, Elena." She pulled me closer, if that was even possible. Her other hand slid down my arm, fingers trailing over the sensitive skin of my inner wrist, resting there like a shackle. "You build these walls so high," she murmured, her voice dropping to a frequency that bypassed my ears and went straight to my spine. "But you forget to lock the gate." I froze. My feet stopped moving. The room spun. "You build the walls so high, E, but you forget to lock the gate." It was a line from a text 3 months ago. A direct quote. I pulled back, staring at her. She wasn't smiling. She was watching me with a terrifying, open intensity, her pupils blown wide. She leaned in, her mouth inches from mine, close enough to share the same oxygen. "You're safer in the dark," she whispered. "Aren't you, E?" The initial was the gavel strike. The music swelled, a crash of drums, but I couldn't hear it. The song ended, leaving us breathless, chest to chest, exposed in the sudden silence. I didn't wait for an encore. I turned on my heel, the friction of the turn burning against the balls of my feet, and I walked. Not ran. Lawyers don't run. But I moved with a velocity that bordered on flight. I needed walls. I needed silence. I needed to be anywhere but under that amber light with the woman who had just dismantled my entire life with a single initial. I found the venue's library down a long, carpeted corridor. It was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, smelling of dust and unread history. I pushed the heavy oak door shut and leaned against it, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. My hands were shaking so hard, I had to press them against the cool wood of the doorframe to steady them. The silence here was heavy, a physical weight after the roar of the reception. Then the handle turned under my palm. I jumped back as the door swung open. Liliana slipped inside, a flash of emerald in the gloom. She didn't say a word. She just turned and threw the brass bolt of the lock. Click. The sound was final. It severed the tether to the wedding, to Claire, to the E who followed rules. We were in a vacuum now. "You knew," I said. My voice was brittle, unrecognizable. "You stood there in the garden. You sat next to me at dinner, and you knew the whole time. It was a game to you." "It wasn't a game, Elena." She moved further into the room, the moonlight from the tall windows catching the sharp plane of her cheekbones. She looked tired, the arrogance stripped away to reveal something rawer. It was a hypothesis, a terrifying, desperate hypothesis. "You used my own words against me." "I used our words," she corrected, stepping closer. She stopped by a heavy mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the edge. 3 weeks ago, you mentioned a scar on your knee from a childhood bike accident. I was there when it happened, Elena. I was the one who carried you inside. Then you talked about the specific way you hate Earl Grey tea because it tastes like perfume and sadness. That's a direct quote from a conversation we had 4 years ago in your kitchen. So you let me keep talking. You let me strip myself bare while you took notes. "I let you keep talking because I needed it to be you," she whispered. The confession hung in the air, fragile and sharp. I needed to know if the mind that challenged me, the soul that matched mine in the dark, I needed to know if it belonged to the one person I was prohibited from wanting. And then I saw you tonight. I saw the way you touched your phone like it was a lifeline. I smelled the sandalwood on your skin, the same scent I described to V last week. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a vertigo that made the floor tilt. She wasn't mocking me. She was just as terrified. The distance between us, The years, the sister, the history felt suddenly porous. I thought I was safe, I admitted, my voice barely a murmur. I thought V was the escape. V isn't an escape, Liliana said, closing the distance. She stopped inches from me, her heat radiating through the cool library air. She's the truth. We just needed a dark room to admit it. She reached out, her hand hovering near my face. This time, I didn't flinch. I leaned into it. Her palm cupped my jaw, her thumb brushing the corner of my mouth. A gesture of reverence, not possession. The contact was electric, a grounding wire for a year's worth of static. Tell me to stop, she breathed, her eyes searching mine. Cite a precedent. Give me a statute. Tell me to leave. Overruled, I whispered. She didn't hesitate. She surged forward, and her mouth found mine. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't a testing of waters. It was a collision. The physical manifestation of every text, every late-night confession, every suppressed desire crashing into reality. Her lips were soft, tasting of champagne and urgency. I gripped her waist, pulling her flush against me, verifying the solidity of her. The kiss deepened, becoming a conversation without syntax, a desperate attempt to make up for lost time. Her hands tangled in my hair, pulling my head back, exposing my throat to the cool air and her hot breath. It was messy and overwhelming and perfect. It was a complex algorithm finally resolving into a single, undeniable integer. When we finally broke apart, breathless and bruised, the silence of the library felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of us. Liliana rested her forehead against mine, our breathing synchronized in the quiet. We have to go back, she whispered, her thumb tracing my lower lip. They'll notice. I know, I said, though the idea of the bright, loud world outside felt impossible. But we can't go back to what we were. No, she agreed, pulling back to look at me, her eyes dark and clear. The firewall is down, counselor. No more encryption. The morning sun was an indictment. It bleached the Hudson Valley white, exposing every smudge on the glassware, every crumb on the linen, and every secret left over from the night before. The post-wedding brunch was held on the same terrace where I'd almost confessed, but the atmosphere had shifted from sultry to clinical. Guests moved with the fragile, shuffling gait of the hungover, shielding their eyes behind oversized sunglasses. I stood near the coffee urn, clutching a ceramic mug like it was a piece of evidence I refused to surrender. My internal monologue was running a frantic discovery process, cataloging the risks. Did anyone see us leave the library? Did my hair look disheveled when I returned to my room? Did the smell of her, sandalwood and rain, still cling to the collar of my blazer? Claire was sitting at a wrought iron table near the railing, picking at a croissant. She looked terrifyingly composed. In my head, I was already building the defense. Your Honor, the defendant acted under duress of extreme compatibility. I approached the table, my heels clicking a rhythm that sounded too much like a countdown. I needed to control the narrative before the prosecution could make an opening statement. Morning, I said, sliding into the chair opposite her. You look tired, Claire observed, not looking up from her plate. Her voice was neutral, devoid of the usual sisterly warmth. Long night, I hedged, taking a sip of coffee that tasted like battery acid. It must have been. She finally looked up. Her eyes were clear, sharp. I looked for you. After the speeches. You were gone. So was Liliana. The air left the conversation. The name sat between us, heavy and unavoidable. This was it, the cross-examination. I stiffened, preparing to deflect, to lie, to protect the fragile peace of the family. Claire, listen. Don't, she interrupted, raising a hand. It wasn't an angry gesture. It was a stop sign. Just don't give me the lawyer version. I saw you two on the dance floor, Elle. I saw the way her hand was on your back. I saw the way you stopped breathing when she whispered to you. I closed my mouth. The defense crumbled. There was no precedent for this. I'm sorry, I said. And for the first time in years, it wasn't strategic. It was raw. I didn't plan for this. I didn't know it was her until yesterday. Claire sighed, a long exhale that seemed to deflate her posture. She looked out at the river, then back at me. I know. You're too disciplined to start a war on purpose. And frankly, you're terrible at hiding it.
Hiding what?
The charge, she said, waving a hand vaguely between us. The static. Whatever that terrifying electricity is that happens when you two are in the same zip code. She took a sip of her coffee. We never had that. Liliana and I, we were safe. We were a checklist of what a couple should look like. But we never looked at each other the way she looked at you last night. Like she wanted to devour you and debate you at the same time. I don't want to hurt you, I whispered. You're not, Claire said, and her smile was small but genuine. We were wrong for each other, Elle. We both know it. She needs someone who fights back. She needs someone who lives in her head as much as her bed. That's not me. It never was. She reached across the table, covering my hand with hers. But I've never seen you this alive. Terrified, yes, but alive. Don't apologize for that. The verdict was in. Not guilty. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for 24 hours vanished, replaced by a light, dizzying sense of vertigo. The knot between my shoulder blades, a permanent fixture of my anatomy, finally began to loosen. I had the evidence. I had the confession, and now, impossibly, I had the permission to stop fighting the case and just live it. It took 3 weeks for the silence in my apartment to change. For years, my space had been a sterile sanctuary, a place of high ceilings, mid-century furniture, and the kind of quiet that rings in your ears. Now, the silence was heavier, warmer. It was populated. I sat in the corner of the velvet sofa, a stack of case files ignored on the floor, while Liliana occupied the other end. Her legs were tangled with mine under a throw blanket, a complex, lazy knot of denim and bare skin that defied untying. We weren't texting. The phones, our former lifelines, our previous avatars, were face down on the side table, dark and silent. We didn't need the interface anymore. We had the bandwidth of the real thing. The transition from the digital fantasy of V to the physical reality of Liliana hadn't been seamless. It was a collision of habits and stubbornness. I learned that she drank her coffee black and judged my oat milk with a playful sneer. I learned she left half-read essays on every flat surface, turning my organized living room into a chaotic library. I learned that she challenged my logic, not just with text bubbles I could ignore until I had a rebuttal, but with a raised eyebrow and a voice that demanded an immediate answer. It was a domestic negotiation I hadn't prepared for, but one I found myself eager to lose. The fantasy of V was perfect because it was curated. V was a projection of my own intellect reflected back at me. Liliana was a separate entity, a friction that created heat rather than just mirroring it. She was messy, she was opinionated, she was real. And God, the reality was so much better than the ghost. I watched her read. The afternoon light caught the dust motes dancing around her, illuminating the fine lines near her eyes that the low-res profile picture had never shown. I knew her mind before I knew her body, but learning the topography of her physical presence felt like the second half of a map I'd been trying to read in the dark. I loved the flaws. I loved the tiny scar on her shoulder, the one she'd typed about months ago, that I could now trace with my own fingertips. I loved the heat of her skin, a constant, radiating proof that I wasn't alone. The digital V was safe, contained in my pocket, but Liliana was expansive, filling the room with her scent and her intellect. We had traded the safety of the firewall for the messy, terrifying vulnerability of the open air. We had abandoned the control of the edit button for the improvisation of touch. It was dangerous. It was unscripted. It was the bravest thing I had ever done. Liliana shifted, sensing my gaze. She didn't look up from her book immediately. A slow smile spread across her face, the one that used to terrify me across a dinner table, and now just made my chest ache. "You're staring, counselor," she murmured, her voice rough with disuse. "I'm gathering evidence," I countered, shifting my leg so the friction of our skin increased. "And what's the verdict?" "That the risk was worth the discovery." She finally looked up, closing the book with a soft thud. She reached out, her hand finding the back of my neck, fingers threading through my hair with that specific, heavy pressure that grounded me to the earth. It wasn't just comfort, it was a claim. A physical reminder that the ghost was gone, replaced by a woman who took up space, who demanded to be held, who turned the abstract concept of desire into a concrete, breathing fact. "Good," she whispered, pulling me forward until our foreheads rested together. "Because the statute of limitations on this, it doesn't exist. I'm not going anywhere." I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of sandalwood and old paper, and finally, fully, let the call drop. We spent a year building a fortress of words to protect ourselves, only to realize the only thing worth having was the person standing outside the gate. If you want to see more stories where the risk of intimacy pays off in ways you never expected, hit that subscribe button. Join us next time, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is tell the truth.